Hello Guy, welcome back to my new channel. When we gaze upon the wonders of ancient Egypt, our vision is captured, almost hypnotized by the monumental. We see the Great Pyramids, the temples of Karnak, the golden mask of Tutankhamun. These are the final, glorious achievements of a civilization that seemed to possess an almost superhuman mastery of engineering and art. But these achievements did not spring fully formed from the desert sands. They were the final chapter in a much longer, quieter, and arguably more foundational story. This is the story of the time before the Pharaohs, the long millennia of Predynastic Egypt. It is a period often dismissed as a primitive prelude, a simple overture to the grand opera of the dynastic age. But within this supposed prelude lies a hidden world of breathtaking technological innovation. A world where the fundamental skills that would later build the pyramids were born and perfected. This is the story of that hidden world. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. To begin our journey into the lost technologies of Predynastic Egypt, we must first travel back to the very bedrock of human ingenuity. Before metallurgy, before ceramics, before the wheel, there was stone. The manipulation of stone, what archaeologists call lithic technology, is the longest-running and most fundamental conversation between the human mind and the natural world. For hundreds of thousands of years, the ability to see a potential tool locked inside a dull piece of rock, and the skill to release that form, was the single most important factor in our survival and development. In the Nile Valley, this conversation reached a level of fluency and artistry that is difficult to comprehend. The Predynastic period was not merely a continuation of earlier Stone Age traditions, it was a crucible of intense innovation. It was during these millennia that the inhabitants of the Nile Valley transformed stone from a simple tool of survival into a medium of profound social, ritual, and aesthetic expression. They didn't just make sharp rocks, they developed a deep geological intimacy with their landscape, learning to select, quarry, and work different types of stone with a purpose and precision that laid the groundwork for all the monumental achievements to come. To understand their world, we must first understand how they saw, shaped, and revered the very bones of the earth. The story of stone in Egypt does not begin with the first farmers of the Predynastic, but stretches back into the unfathomable depths of the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age. For hundreds of thousands of years, early hominins roamed a very different Egyptian landscape, one that was wetter and greener than today. These early people were the inheritors of the Acheulean tradition, producing the iconic teardrop-shaped hand axes that are found across Africa, Europe, and Asia. These were not simple tools. The creation of a symmetrical, bifacial hand axe from a rough cobble of flint requires foresight, planning, and a sophisticated understanding of fracture mechanics. It is a multi-step process that cannot be learned by simple imitation. It must be taught and transmitted. It represents a cognitive leap, a mind capable of holding a complex three-dimensional form as a mental template, and then executing a long sequence of precise actions to achieve it. This deep legacy of skilled flint knapping formed the ancient technological substrate upon which later innovations were built. The people of the Nile Valley had been mastering the art of controlled fracture for an immense span of time, their skills passed down through countless generations. Later in the Paleolithic, another crucial cognitive and technological revolution occurred in the Nile Valley, the development of the Levallois technique. This was a revolutionary method for producing stone tools that demonstrated an even greater level of abstract thought and planning. Instead of working a piece of stone down into a single tool like a hand axe, the napper would meticulously prepare a core of flint, shaping it into a specific form like a tortoise shell. This preparation phase involved dozens of carefully controlled strikes. The final single decisive blow would then detach a flake from this prepared core, a flake that was already perfectly shaped and sharp-edged, requiring little to no further modification. This was, in essence, the invention of the standardized blank. The napper was not just thinking about the final tool, they were thinking about the process of manufacturing itself, planning several steps ahead to create a predictable and efficient outcome. This ability to conceptualize a tool within a core, to prepare that core through a complex sequence, and to produce a finished product with a single strike, is a stunning example of abstract reasoning. The minds that mastered the Levallois technique were the deep ancestors of the minds that would later plan the construction of pyramids. They were masters of process, sequence, and precision. The primary material for this long conversation with stone was a substance born of ancient seas, flint, and its close relative, chert. Geologically, these are microcrystalline varieties of quartz that formed as nodules within the vast limestone deposits that flank the Nile Valley. For a flint napper, this material was a gift. It is exceptionally hard, yet brittle in a predictable way, allowing a skilled artisan to control its fracture with remarkable precision. A properly struck piece of flint breaks with what is called a conchoidal fracture, producing a curved surface like the inside of a seashell and leaving an edge that is phenomenally sharp on a molecular level. A freshly napped flint edge can be sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. The Predynastic Egyptians became master prospectors, learning to identify the best sources of this critical resource. They would seek out flint nodules weathering out of the limestone cliffs or collected from the desert floor. In some areas where high-quality flint lay in subterranean seams, they undertook the earliest mining operations in history, sinking shafts and digging galleries deep into the rock to extract the precious, unweathered nodules, a clear indication of just how vital this material was to their society. The end of the last ice age brought about profound environmental changes, leading to the gradual desiccation of the Sahara and concentrating human populations along the fertile ribbon of the Nile Valley. This period saw the slow adoption of agriculture and animal husbandry, a shift known as the Neolithic Revolution, which fundamentally altered the relationship between people and their tools. The toolkit of the mobile hunter-gatherer was no longer sufficient. A settled agricultural life required a new suite of technologies. One of the most critical new tools was the sickle, to harvest the newly domesticated grains like emmer wheat and barley. Farmers needed an efficient cutting tool. The solution was a composite tool, a series of small, sharp flint blades, known as sickle inserts, were set into a wooden or bone handle, using bitumen or resin as an adhesive. These small, standardized and easily replaceable blades were a key innovation. Over time, as these flint sickles were used to cut silica-rich grasses, a distinctive glossy sheen, known as sickle gloss, would form on the cutting edge, a telltale sign for archaeologists of the dawn of agriculture. Alongside the sickle came the need for grinding stones, saddle querns and handstones, used to process the harvested grain into flour, a laborious but essential daily task that formed the rhythmic backdrop to Neolithic life. Another key innovation of the Neolithic era was the polished stone axe. While chipped flint was perfect for cutting and scraping, it was less suitable for heavy-duty woodworking tasks like felling trees or shaping large timbers for construction. For this, a tougher, more resilient tool was needed. The Neolithic Egyptians began to craft axe heads from harder, non-flint, igneous and metamorphic rocks like basalt and diorite. The process was fundamentally different from flint knap. Instead of chipping, these tougher stones were shaped by a slow, painstaking process of pecking with a harder hammerstone, grinding the surface against an abrasive rock like sandstone, and finally polishing it with sand and water. This could take hundreds of hours of labor for a single axe head. The resulting tool, with its smooth, polished surface and tough, sharp edge, was far more durable and resistant to shock than a chipped flint axe. The development of this technology was essential for clearing land for farming and for the burgeoning craft of carpentry, enabling the construction of more substantial dwellings and funerary structures. It represented a new branch of lithic knowledge, one based on abrasion and patience rather than controlled fracture. The first true predynastic culture to emerge, known as the Badarian period, circa 4400–4000 BCE, shows a marked refinement in flint knapping technology. While their tools were still primarily functional, arrowheads for hunting, scrapers for working hides, and sickle blades for farming, the quality and elegance of their production set a new standard. Badarian flint knappers produced beautiful, thin, bifacially worked tools. They had mastered a technique known as ripple flaking, where a series of parallel, overlapping pressure flakes were removed from the surface of the flint, creating a beautiful, undulating, rippled effect. This technique required immense skill and control. It was not strictly necessary for the tool's function. A simpler tool would have cut just as well. The presence of this exquisite, decorative flaking suggests something new is happening. A growing appreciation for aesthetics, a desire to create objects of beauty, and perhaps the emergence of craft specialists, individuals whose skill was so renowned that their work was sought after for its artistic merit as much as its utility. The Badarian ripple-flaked sickles and arrowheads are not just tools, they are the first whisperings of the Egyptian pursuit of perfection, the earliest sign of a culture that would come to fuse art and function in extraordinary ways. The subsequent Naqada I period, circa 4000–3500 BCE, also known as the Amrasian, saw these trends continue and develop. The lithic toolkit became more diverse and specialized. One of the most distinctive new forms was the fishtail knife, a beautifully crafted bifacial knife with a flaring, V-shaped handle that resembles the tail of a fish. These knives are often found in high-status burials, suggesting they were more than simple utilitarian objects. They were likely symbols of prestige and power, personal possessions that signified the owner's rank in society. The craftsmanship of the Naqada I period continued to build on the Badarian legacy, with exceptionally fine pressure flaking and carefully controlled shape. The production of these high-quality items indicates a society with an increasingly complex social structure. The labor and skill required to produce such a knife meant it was not available to everyone. It was a luxury good, a clear marker of an emerging elite who had the resources to command the work of the most talented artisans. The stone tool was no longer just for interacting with the environment. It was now a key medium for negotiating social status among humans. The technological and artistic apex of predynastic flint knapping was reached in the Naqada Turcan period, circa 3500–3200 BCE. This era produced some of the most extraordinarily skillful works of stone craftsmanship the world has ever seen. The flint knappers of this period, building on millennia of accumulated knowledge, created ceremonial knives of breathtaking beauty and technical perfection. These were not tools for everyday work. They were magnificent, oversized objects of immense prestige, destined for the tombs of the most powerful rulers who were consolidating their control over the Nile Valley. The most famous of these are the so-called rhomboidal daggers and the Gebel el-Arak knife. These objects were crafted from a specific type of high-quality, caramel-colored, banded flint. Their surfaces were ground and polished to a flawless smoothness, a feat of immense labor in itself. Then, one side of the polished blade was subjected to the most refined and controlled ripple flaking imaginable. The flakes are so regular, so parallel, so perfectly matched, that the surface resembles a gentle corduroy texture frozen in stone. The opposite side of the blade was often left polished and undecorated, showcasing the natural beauty of the banded flint. The creation of these masterpiece knives involved a sophisticated and multi-stage technological process that modern flint knappers have struggled to replicate. The process began with the careful selection of a large, flawless piece of high-quality flint. This was painstakingly shaped into the desired form of the knife using a combination of percussion and pressure flaking. The surface was then ground down to create a perfectly flat, smooth face. This was an incredibly laborious process, likely using sandstone blocks and a slurry of water and abrasive sand. The next and most crucial stage may have involved a technology that represents a major conceptual leap: heat treatment. Archaeologists and experimental flint knappers have discovered that carefully and slowly heating flint to a specific temperature, around 250–300 degrees Celsius, and then letting it cool slowly, can subtly alter its internal structure, making it more homogeneous and easier to flake with precision. It is highly likely the Naqada tattoo artisans had mastered this technique. After heat treatment, the napper would begin the final, delicate process of ripple flake. This was likely done using a pressure flaking technique, where a pointed tool of copper or antler was placed on the edge of the blade and pressure was applied, pushing off a long, thin, parallel-sided flake. To achieve the stunning regularity seen on the ceremonial knives required a level of motor control and material understanding that is almost superhuman. The edges of these magnificent knives were then further refined through a final, microscopic level of serration. The napper would use a fine pressure flaking tool to remove tiny, closely spaced flakes along the cutting edge, creating a row of minute, sharp teeth. This micro-serration made the edge incredibly sharp and effective for cutting soft materials. The final product was an object of almost impossible perfection. The handle was often a separate piece, made of ivory or bone, and sometimes exquisitely carved. The famous Gebel el Arak knife, for instance, features a handle of hippopotamus ivory, intricately carved on one side with scenes of boats and warfare, and on the other, with a Mesopotamian-style master of animals figure, a hero grappling with two lions. This fusion of a perfect flint blade with a politically charged, artistically rendered handle shows that these objects were at the absolute pinnacle of predynastic technology and ideology. They were the ultimate symbols of power, status, and command over both the natural and the human world. They were not tools for cutting reeds, they were tools for building kingdoms. While flint knapping represented one major branch of predynastic stone technology, a parallel and equally important tradition was developing in the art of grinding and polishing harder stones. This technology found its most characteristic expression in the creation of cosmetic palettes. From the earliest Badarian period, small, simple, rectangular palettes made of siltstone or slate were a common feature in burials. These palettes were used for grinding minerals like green malachite, a copper ore, or black galena, a lead ore, into powders for eye makeup. This makeup was not just for beautification. It was believed to have magical, protective qualities, particularly in warding off eye infections caused by the sun's glare and dust, and in deflecting the evil eye. The palette was therefore a fundamental part of the Egyptian personal toolkit, a small slab of technology for health and magic. Over the course of the predynastic period, these simple, functional palettes evolved into increasingly elaborate and symbolic objects. In the Nakada II periods, the simple rectangular palettes began to be shaped into animal forms. We find palettes carved in the shape of fish, birds, turtles, and gazelles. These were not crude outlines, they were beautifully observed, stylized representations of the fauna of the Nile Valley. The skill required to shape these hard stones into elegant, recognizable forms using only abrasive techniques was considerable. These zoomorphic palettes were clearly objects of personal pride and status. The grinding surface remained the central focus, but the object itself was now a piece of portable art, imbued with the symbolic power of the animal it represented. As the predynastic period drew to a close and society moved towards unification and the establishment of the first pharaohs, these palettes underwent a final, dramatic transformation. They grew in size, becoming large, ceremonial objects, no longer intended for personal use. Their surfaces became the canvas for the first great works of Egyptian relief carving, depicting complex scenes of royal ideology, warfare, and ritual. Masterpieces like the hunter's palette and the battlefield palette chronicle the rise of a powerful ruling class and their military triumph. This evolution culminates in the most famous of all, the Nama palette, a ceremonial object that depicts King Nama's victory and the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, marking the very beginning of the dynastic age. The humble grinding slab for makeup had become the primary medium for announcing the birth of a nation. The skills of grinding and polishing hard stone were not limited to flat palettes. The pre-dynastic Egyptians undertook an even more challenging technological feat, the creation of stone vessels from some of the hardest rocks available, including basalt, diorite, porphyry, and granite. This is one of the most remarkable and often overlooked technologies of the era. The process of hollowing out a vessel from a solid block of a material as hard as granite, without the use of metal tools capable of cutting it, is a stunning testament to their ingenuity and patience. The process began by quarrying a suitable block and roughly shaping the exterior by pounding it with hard diorite hammerstones. The truly difficult part was the hollowing of the interior. The artisans would begin by drilling a central core. This was done using a simple but effective drill, likely a forked stick with a crank handle, which was used to rotate a hollow tube of wood or copper. Abrasive sand, probably quartz, was fed into the drill hole with water. The rotating tube, combined with the abrasive sand, would slowly grind its way down into the hard stone, leaving a central cylindrical core. Once the central core was drilled to the desired depth, it was snapped off and removed. This left a deep, cylindrical hole. The rest of the interior had to be hollowed out and widened. This was achieved using a variety of stone borers, oddly shaped, crescent-like pieces of flint or other hard stone attached to a handle. These borers were inserted into the hole and rotated, again with the help of abrasive sand, to slowly grind away the interior walls of the vessel. The process would have been incredibly time-consuming, requiring endless patience and physical effort. It was a slow, agonizing process of abrasion. Once the interior was hollowed out to the desired shape, the final stages of grinding and polishing both the interior and exterior surfaces began, using finer and finer grades of abrasive grit until the vessel had a smooth, often lustrous finish. The result was a thing of immense beauty and technical virtuosity. These stone vessels, with their elegant forms and beautiful, naturally patterned materials, were the ultimate luxury items of the Predynastic period. They were far more valuable than pottery, and their presence in a tomb was a clear indicator of immense wealth and status. The technology demonstrated a complete mastery of abrasive techniques that would be essential for later dynastic projects of sculpting and dressing stone on a monumental scale. The third crucial category of groundstone technology was the mace head. The earliest mace heads, found in the Nakada Dawath period, were typically disc-shaped. They were carved from a variety of stones, from softer limestone and alabaster to harder materials like basalt. A hole was drilled through the center to allow the head to be mounted on a wooden handle. This early form, with its sharp disc-like edge, was likely an effective weapon capable of inflicting serious cutting or slashing wounds in combat. It was a weapon of war in an increasingly competitive society where control over land and resources was becoming more contested. The presence of these weapons in male burials indicates the growing importance of the warrior identity for the predynastic elite. The mace was not just a tool for hunting, it was a symbol of authority and martial prowess. During the Nakada Toato period, a significant and ominous change occurred in the design of the mace head. The flat, disc-shaped form was gradually replaced by a new, more formidable design, the pear-shaped mace head. This new shape represented a major technological advance in weaponry. Instead of distributing the force of a blow along a wide, cutting edge, the pear-shaped design concentrated the entire force of the impact onto a single, small, rounded point. This made it a devastatingly effective bludgeoning weapon, capable of shattering bone and crushing a skull, even one protected by a rudimentary helmet. The shift from the discoid to the pear-shaped mace head reflects a brutal escalation in the intensity and lethality of warfare. As local chieftains vied for power and sought to expand their territories, combat became more serious, and weapons evolved to become more deadly. By the end of the Predynastic period, the pear-shaped mace, like the cosmetic palette, had transcended its functional role as a weapon and become one of the most powerful symbols of kingship. The largest and most beautifully crafted mace heads were no longer intended for use in actual combat. They were ceremonial objects, emblems of the ruler's supreme authority and his role as a warrior who brings order to chaos. Two of the most important artifacts from the threshold of Egyptian history are the scorpion macehead and the Nama macehead. These are massive, exquisitely carved limestone maceheads, covered in relief scenes that depict the king performing important rituals and celebrating military victories. On the Nama macehead, the king is shown seated on a throne, wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, presiding over a festival where captives and tribute are paraded before him. The mace itself, the instrument of brutal physical force, has become a symbol of legitimate, divinely sanctioned royal power. It is the scepter of the first pharaohs, its form a direct inheritance from the escalating violence of the late Predynastic period. The incredible array of stone technologies, developed during the Predynastic period, laid the essential foundation for the monumental explosion of the dynastic age. The millennia spent mastering the principles of controlled fracture in flint gave the Egyptians an unparalleled understanding of how to work stone. The skills honed in creating the minute, parallel ripple flakes on a ceremonial knife were the same skills, scaled up, that would be needed to dress the massive limestone casing blocks of the Great Pyramid with breathtaking precision. The patience and knowledge developed in hollowing out a small diorite vessel using sand and abrasion were the same principles that would be applied to sculpt the colossal granite statues of the pharaohs. The organizational capacity required to prospect for and mine the best flint seams was the seed of the logistical genius that would be needed to quarry and transport millions of tons of stone for a single pyramid. The Predynastic period was Egypt's great school of stone. It was during these supposedly primitive centuries that the tacit knowledge, the muscle memory, and the technological mindset were forged. The pyramids did not rise from a vacuum. They rose from a deep and ancient tradition of lithic mastery, born in the hands of the forgotten artists and engineers of the time before the pharaohs. The legacy of these predynastic stone technologies is therefore profound and multifaceted. It is a story of cognitive evolution from the simple hand axe to the complex sequential thought of the lavillois technique. It is a story of artistic evolution from the purely functional to the aesthetically refined, culminating in objects of sublime beauty that were also potent symbols of social power. And it is a story of technological continuity, where the skills developed on a small personal scale became the building blocks for one of the greatest monumental civilizations the world has ever known. The flint knappers, the vessel grinders, and the weapon makers of the Predynastic were not primitive savages. They were scientists, artists, and engineers, engaged in a silent, multi-generational dialogue with their geological environment. They were the unsung pioneers, whose accumulated knowledge and skill made the age of the pharaohs possible. To truly appreciate the Great Pyramid, one must first appreciate the perfect, tiny ripple flake on a Nakada earthen knife. One is simply the magnificent echo of the other. If the story of stone represents humanity's first great conversation with the earth, a dialogue of fracture and percussion, then our next chapter tells of a second, more intimate, and ultimately more transformative conversation. This is a story of alchemy, of taking the soft, pliable flesh of the land, the clay of the Nile's floodplain, and transforming it through the purifying power of fire into something entirely new. This is the story of ceramic. The invention and refinement of pottery was far more than simply the creation of containers. It was a revolution that touched every aspect of predynastic life. It changed the way people ate, stored their wealth, expressed their artistic impulses, and conceived of the ceramic vessel was the laboratory where early Egyptians mastered pyrotechnology, the controlled use of fire, a skill that would later be essential for metallurgy and glass making. The broken shards of these ancient pots are the most common artifacts found in predynastic sites, and they are our most eloquent storytellers. They are the alphabet through which archaeologists have learned to read the timelines, social structures, and belief systems of these forgotten millennia. To trace the evolution of a simple clay pot is to trace the very trajectory of a civilization on the verge of pharaonic glory. The raw material for this revolution was, like so much in Egypt, a gift of the Nile. The annual inundation deposited not just fertile silt for farming, but also vast beds of clay. The predynastic artisans, with their deep intuitive understanding of their local geology, recognized two primary types of this essential resource, and their choice would determine the entire character of their finished product. The first and by far the most common was Nile silt clay. This was an alluvial clay, rich in organic matter and fine sand, gathered from the riverbanks and the floodplain. When fired, it turned a characteristic range of colors, from a deep, rich red-brown to a dark gray or black, depending on the amount of oxygen present during the firing process. It was a versatile, everyday material, plastic and easy to work with, but its organic impurities meant it had to be fired at relatively low temperatures, typically between 500 and 800 degrees Celsius, to prevent it from bloating or cracking. This was the clay of the people, the substance that would form the vast majority of all the pottery ever made in ancient Egypt, the material used for cooking pots, beer jars, bread molds, and simple domestic dishes. The second, and far more prized material was marl clay. This was not found on the floodplain, but was quarried from the desert cliffs, particularly in the regions around Kina and Luxor in Upper Egypt. Marl clay is a geological clay, formed from ancient shale and limestone deposits, and it has a very different chemical composition from the river silt. It contains far fewer organic impurities and iron oxides, but has a higher concentration of calcium carbonates and salt. This meant it could be, and needed to be, fired at a much higher temperature, between 800 and then 50 degrees Celsius. This higher firing temperature produced a much harder, denser, and less porous ceramic body. The finished color of marl clay pottery was also distinct, ranging from a pale creamy white or buff to a greenish gray. It was a more difficult material to work with, less plastic than the Nile silt, but its durability and pale, clean surface made it the ideal canvas for painted decoration. Marl clay was the material of choice for the emerging elite. It was used to create the fine, decorated wares that would be filled with precious oils and perfumes, objects designed not for the kitchen, but for conspicuous consumption in life, and for accompanying the powerful into the afterlife. The simple choice between the mud of the river and the clay of the desert was a choice that defined the status and purpose of the finished object. Once the clay was prospected and quarried, the manufacturing process, or chaîne opératoire, began. This was a sequence of steps, each one critical to the success of the final product, and it reveals a sophisticated understanding of material science. The first stage was clay preparation. Raw clay, dug from the earth, is full of impurities, pebbles, roots, shells, and other debris that can cause a pot to crack during drying or firing. To remove these, the predynastic potters employed a process called levitation. They would mix the raw clay with a large amount of water in a settling pit or basin. The heavier impurities would sink to the bottom, while the finest, purest clay particles would remain suspended in the water. This clay-rich water was then carefully decanted into a shallower basin and left to evaporate in the sun. As the water evaporated, it left behind a bed of pure, fine plastic clay. This was a simple but highly effective method of refining their raw material, a critical first step in quality control. The next step was the addition of a temper. While levitation removed unwanted large impurities, the potter often needed to deliberately add a different kind of material to the clay body to improve its working and firing properties. This added material is known as temper. The type of temper used depended on the type of clay and the intended function of the vessel. For Nile silt clays, which were often used for cooking pots, the most common temper was chopped straw or animal dung. The organic fibers of the temper would burn out during firing, leaving behind tiny, interconnected pores within the clay wall. This porosity was a deliberate technological choice. It made the pot more resistant to thermal shock, meaning it was less likely to crack when repeatedly heated and cooled over a cooking fire. For other types of pottery, different tempers were used. Sand could be added to reduce shrinkage during drying, while crushed pottery shards, grog, or crushed shells could be added to increase the strength of the clay body. The predynastic potter was, in essence, a master chef, creating different clay recipes by carefully balancing the properties of the pure clay with precisely chosen additives to achieve a desired technological outcome. With the clay paste prepared to the correct consistency, the process of forming the vessel began. It is crucial to remember that for the entire predynastic period, and indeed for most of Egyptian history, the fast potter's wheel was not used. Every single one of the millions of pots produced was built by hand, using a variety of skillful and time-consuming techniques. The simplest method, used for small bowls and cups, was pinch. A potter would take a ball of clay, press their thumb into the center, and then slowly pinch and rotate the ball, thinning and raising the walls to create a simple, open vessel. It is a direct and intimate method, the shape of the pot guided entirely by the potter's hand. The slight irregularities and fingerprints often found on these simple vessels are a tangible link, a direct connection to the individual artisan who shaped the clay thousands of years ago. For larger and more complex forms such as storage jars and bottles, the primary construction method was coiling. The potter would begin by creating a flat, disc-shaped base. Then they would roll out long, snake-like coils of clay. The first coil was attached to the perimeter of the base, and then subsequent coils were stacked one on top of the other to build up the walls of the vessel. The key to this technique was the careful blending or welding of the coils together. Using their fingers, and perhaps a simple tool made of bone or wood, the potter would smooth the inside and outside surfaces, obliterating the seams between the coils and creating a strong, unified wall. This method allowed for the creation of large, symmetrical vessels with complex curving profiles. The elegant, undulating forms of many predynastic jars are a testament to the immense skill of these artisans, who could control the angle and thickness of the coils to create sophisticated shapes without the aid of a wheel. Many pots, when broken, will show a characteristic spiral fracture pattern, revealing the hidden coil construction beneath the smoothed surface. Another sophisticated technique used by predynastic potters was the paddle and anvil method. This was often used in conjunction with coiling to thin, strengthen, and shape the walls of a vessel. The potter would hold a smooth, rounded stone, the anvil, inside the pot, while striking the exterior surface with a flat wooden paddle. This action compressed the clay particles between the two surfaces, making the wall thinner and denser, and helping to further weld the coils together. The paddle and anvil technique was also a way to create large, globular forms, like cooking pots, allowing the potter to expand the walls outwards from the inside. In some traditions, the paddle was wrapped with cord or fabric, which left a distinctive textured impression on the pot's exterior. This cord-marked pottery is found in many Neolithic cultures around the world, and its presence in early predynastic sites speaks to the shared technological heritage of early farming communities. Once the basic form of the vessel was built, the potter's work was far from over. The next stage involved a series of surface treatments designed to refine the pot's aesthetic and functional qualities. The first step was usually scraping and smoothing. As the pot dried to a leather-hard state firm enough to handle but still workable, the potter would use a sharp edge, perhaps a flint flake or a shell, to scrape away any lumps or irregularities from the surface, refining the shape and thinning the walls further. They would then smooth the surface with a damp cloth or a piece of soft leather, creating a uniform matte finish. This attention to surface quality, even on the most common domestic wares, shows a deep-seated appreciation for craftsmanship and a desire to produce a well-finished product. For finer wares, the potter would employ a more laborious and transformative technique, burnishing. While the pot was still in its leather-hard state, the potter would take a small, smooth, hard object, typically a polished river pebble or a piece of bone, and meticulously rub the entire surface of the pot. This action had a dual effect. It compressed and compacted the fine clay particles on the surface, creating a harder, less porous skin. But more importantly, it aligned all these tiny particles in the same direction, creating a surface that after firing would have a beautiful, low-sheen luster. Burnished pottery has a warm, tactile, almost waxy feel to it, and it gleams as it catches the light. The process was incredibly time-consuming, requiring hours of patient, repetitive rubbing to achieve a consistent, high-quality burnish. The brilliant gloss on the finest predynastic black-topped and red-polished wares is not a glaze, it is the direct result of this intense, manual polishing, a testament to the immense labor invested in these luxury objects. Beyond shaping and burnishing, the surface of the pot also became a canvas for decoration. In the earlier predynastic periods, incised decoration was common. Using a pointed tool of bone or flint, the potter would carve geometric patterns into the leather-hard clay. These could be simple lines, chevrons, zigzags, or complex cross-hatched designs. Sometimes, after firing, these incised lines would be filled with a white gypsum paste to make the pattern stand out dramatically against the dark, polished surface of the pot. Another decorative technique was the application of a slip. A slip is a very fine, watery solution of clay, often of a different color from the main body of the pot. The vessel would be dipped into the slip or have it painted on, creating a thin, colored coat. The most common was a red ochre slip, which, when fired, produced a vibrant, deep red color. The famous red polished wares of the Naqada IVE period were often made from Nile silt, coated in a hematite-rich slip, and then meticulously burnished before firing to create their characteristic glossy red finish. After all this shaping, smoothing, and decorating, the pot had to undergo the most delicate and perilous stage of its pre-fired existence, drying. A pot that dries too quickly or unevenly will the water molecules leaving the clay body cause it to shrink. And if one part of the pot, like the rim, shrinks faster than another, like the base, immense stress is created, leading to catastrophic failure. The predynastic potters understood this intimately. They would have placed their newly formed vessels in a shaded, protected area, away from the direct sun and strong winds, for a period of several days or even weeks. This allowed the water to evaporate slowly and evenly from the entire vessel, ensuring that the shrinkage was uniform. Only when the pot was completely bone dry, containing no more molecular water, was it ready to face the transformative ordeal of the fire. The thousands of hours of skilled labor invested in a single fine vessel could be undone in a moment by a careless approach to this quiet, patient, but absolutely critical stage. The final act in the alchemical drama of ceramics was the firing. This was the moment of irreversible transformation, where the soft, fragile clay was turned into a hard, durable, and permanent new substance, pottery. The earliest and simplest method of firing used for the vast majority of predynastic wares was the bonfire or open clamp firing. This was not a kiln in the modern sense. The bone-dry pots were carefully stacked in a shallow pit or on a flat piece of ground. They were often stacked upside down, sometimes separated by broken pottery shards to allow for air circulation. A large amount of fuel wood, brush, or very commonly, dried animal dung, which provides a long, slow, even heat, was then heaped over and around the stack of pots. The entire pile was then set alight. The potter's skill lay in controlling this fire. They needed to raise the temperature slowly at first to drive off the final chemically bonded water from the clay, and then bring it up to a peak temperature of several hundred degrees Celsius, and hold it there for a period of time. Open firing was an art, not a science, and it was fraught with peril. A sudden gust of wind could cause a temperature fluctuation, cracking the pots. If two pots were touching, they could fuse together. But the most important variable that the potter could control was the atmosphere of the fire, the amount of oxygen available to the burning fuel and the hot ceramics. An oxidizing atmosphere with plenty of oxygen would allow the iron in the Nile silt clay to rust, producing a characteristic range of orange and red-brown colors. A reducing atmosphere where the oxygen supply was deliberately starved by smothering the fire with more fuel or earth would prevent the iron from oxidizing, producing gray or black colors. Predynastic potters learned to manipulate these atmospheric conditions with remarkable skill, not just to fire their pots successfully, but to achieve specific desired decorative effects. The mastery of fire was the final and most crucial technological step. The most iconic and technologically sophisticated pottery of the early predynastic period is the beautiful black-topped redware, a hallmark of the Nakadaite culture. These vessels, typically elegant beakers and jars, feature a body of highly polished, vibrant red and a contrasting sharp-edged rim of lustrous jet black. For decades, archaeologists debated how this striking two-tone effect was achieved. It is now understood to be the result of a single, ingenious firing process. The pots, which had already been coated in a red slip and meticulously burnished, were placed upside down in the embers of an open bonfire. Their rims and upper bodies were buried in the hot, carbon-rich ash and embers, while their lower bodies remained exposed to the open, oxygen-rich air. This created two distinct firing atmospheres simultaneously. The exposed lower part of the pot fired in an oxidizing atmosphere, turning the red slip a brilliant crimson. The buried upper part, however, was in a reducing atmosphere. The carbon from the embers was absorbed into the clay body, turning it a deep, permanent black. The sharp, clean line between the red and black was not painted on. It was the tidmark of the embers, a testament to an incredible level of pyrotechnological control. This was not a happy accident, it was a deliberate, difficult and highly sought-after aesthetic, a true masterpiece of predynastic alchemy. As society grew more complex and stratified during the Naqada Tefid period, a new style of pottery emerged that would become the primary medium for elite expression: decorated ware, or D-ware. These vessels were typically made from the pale-firing marl clays of the desert, and their light, creamy surface provided the perfect canvas for intricate painted designs. The paint itself was made from a slip rich in iron oxides, which fired to a deep reddish purple. The motifs painted on these vessels are a fascinating window into the mind of the late predynastic world. The most common themes are boats, animals, and human figures. The boats are large, multi-oared vessels, often adorned with two cabins and a standard or emblem representing a specific town or deity. These are not simple fishing skiffs. They are representations of power, trade, and perhaps the sacred barges of the gods or the funerary journey of the deceased. The other motifs on the decorated ware are equally suggestive of a complex symbolic world. We see rows of long-legged flamingos, herds of horned animals, and processions of ostriches, all rendered in a stylized but lively manner. Human figures are also common. Most intriguing are the depictions of female figures, often shown with their arms raised above their heads in a curved U shape. This has been interpreted as a ritual posture, perhaps of worship, mourning, or magical invocation. Sometimes these goddess figures are shown on the boats, reinforcing the sacred nature of the journey. Male figures are also depicted, often as hunters or warriors, sometimes holding maces. These painted scenes are not random doodles. They are the beginnings of a formal artistic canon, a set of recurring images that communicated ideas about social structure, religious belief, and the power of the ruling elite. They are the direct ancestors of the formal, state-sponsored art of the Pharaonic age, and they represent a major cognitive step, the use of pottery not just as a container, but as a medium for narrative and ideology. One particular type of pottery proved to be a Rosetta Stone for the understanding of the entire Predynastic period. These were vessels, most common in the Naqada's second period, with distinctive, wavy handles on their sides. The great archaeologist Sir Flinders Petrie, while excavating thousands of Predynastic graves in the late 19th century, was faced with a major problem. With no written records and no king's lists, how could he place these graves in chronological order? He noticed that the form of these wavy-handled jars changed in a consistent and predictable way over time. The earliest examples had large, functional handles, clearly designed for lifting and tying a rope. In later graves, the handles became smaller and more stylized. Later still, they ceased to be functional handles at all, and became a purely decorative, wavy line incised onto the shoulder of the pot. Petrie realized he could use this stylistic evolution as a chronological marker. He arranged the pots in a sequence from functional to decorative, a process he called sequence dating or seriation. By seeing which other types of pottery and artifacts were found in the graves alongside each type of wavy-handled jar, he was able to create the first relative chronology for the entire Predynastic era, a system that, with some modifications, is still in use today. The humble pot, through its subtle changes in design, had provided the key to unlocking the timeline of a lost world. The ceramic revolution was not just about making pots and pans. The mastery of pyrotechnology opened the door to a range of other innovations. Fired clay was used to create a variety of other objects. Small, stylized human and animal figurines are common finds. The human figurines are often female, with exaggerated hips and breasts, likely serving as fertility charms or votive offerings. Animal figurines, representing cattle, hippos, and other creatures, may have been used in magical rituals designed to ensure successful hunting or the prosperity of the herd. Fired clay was also used to make smaller domestic items, such as spinning whorls for making thread, and even early forms of architectural elements like clay bricks, which, although not as common as sun-dried mud brick, demonstrated a grasp of the principles of creating durable building materials through fire. Each of these applications represented an extension of the same core technological knowledge, the understanding of how to transform clay through fire. The social impact of the ceramic revolution was profound. The ability to create durable, fireproof containers transformed cooking, no longer limited to roasting meat over a fire or heating water with hot stones in a leather bag. People could now make complex stews, soups, and porridges. This broadened the diet and allowed for the more efficient extraction of nutrients from grains and tough cuts of meat. The development of large storage jars was equally revolutionary. It allowed for the long-term storage of grain, beer, wine, and oil, protecting these vital resources from pests and moisture. This was essential for the development of a surplus-based economy. The village leader's power was directly related to the amount of grain he controlled in his storerooms, and these storerooms were filled with massive ceramic jars. Pottery, therefore, was not just a domestic convenience. It was a cornerstone of the new agricultural economy, and a tool for the consolidation of political power. Furthermore, pottery itself became a commodity, a product to be traded. The distinct styles of pottery from different regions, such as the fine marl clay wares from the Naqada region, were traded up and down the Nile. An elegant painted jar from Upper Egypt, found in a tomb in the northern delta, is clear evidence of long-distance trade networks and the movement of both goods and ideas. Pottery also became a key marker of social differentiation. In death, as in life, the quality and quantity of the ceramics in one's tomb was a direct reflection of one's status. A common farmer might be buried with a few simple Nile silt cooking pots and a beer jar. A powerful chieftain, on the other hand, would be interred with dozens of vessels, including magnificent black-topped redware, imported decorated jars filled with exotic oils, and massive storage containers to provide for his eternal sustenance. The humble clay pot became a powerful medium for expressing social identity, wealth, and power, both in this world and the next. The development of ceramic technology also reveals a great deal about the predynastic mind. It shows a society deeply engaged in empirical science. The potters were not following a magical formula, They were experimenting. They were testing different clay sources, different tempers, different firing times, and different atmospheric conditions. They were observing the results, learning from their failures, and passing down their successful innovations through generations of craftspeople. This was a long, slow, and methodical process of research and development. The ability to control so many variables to produce a specific desired outcome, like the black-topped redware, demonstrates a sophisticated scientific mode of thought, one based on observation, experimentation, and the refinement of a complex, multi-stage process. This same cognitive framework, this ability to plan, to experiment, and to control complex processes, would be indispensable for the architects and engineers of the dynastic age. The forms and decorations of Predynastic pottery also give us our most intimate glimpse into their symbolic world. Before writing, these pots were one of the primary ways of transmitting cultural ideas. The recurring motifs on the decorated ware, the powerful boats, the mysterious goddess figures, the rows of animals, are the fragments of a lost mythology and a nascent state ideology. The boats may represent the political power of the chieftains who controlled river trade, or they may be sacred vessels for the gods, or funerary barges for the journey to the afterlife. It is likely they were all of these things at once. The dancing goddess figure may be a representation of a specific deity or a more general symbol of fertility and divine protection. The orderly processions of animals may represent humanity's growing control over the natural world. While we cannot read these pots with the same certainty as we can read hieroglyphic texts, they are nonetheless our richest visual archive of the Predynastic imagination, a testament to a world teeming with symbolic meaning. Ultimately, the ceramic revolution provided Predynastic Egypt with a new skin for its civilization. If stone was the skeleton, the enduring framework, then pottery was the vessel that contained its lifeblood. It was the container for its food, its drink, its wealth, and its ideas. The technology was born from the most common of materials, mud and fire, but it created a permanent and profoundly informative new class of object. The durability of fired clay is a miracle for archaeology. While organic materials like textiles and wood have long since decayed, the broken shards of pottery, the potsherds, are nearly indestructible. A Predynastic village site is a carpet of these sherds, each one a tiny piece of frozen data. By analyzing the clay, the temper, the form, and the decoration of these sherds, an archaeologist can reconstruct trade patterns, determine the relative date of a site, and understand the daily activities and social status of its inhabitants. It is through the careful study of this humble, broken tableware that much of the story of Predynastic Egypt has been written. The pot, even in its shattered state, continues to speak. The legacy of this ceramic mastery is clear. The Predynastic potters were the true pioneers of pyrotechnology in the Nile Valley. The lessons learned in the bonfire kiln were the first steps on a long road that would lead to the smelting of copper, the casting of bronze, and the creation of the brilliant, glass-like faience that became a hallmark of pharaonic art. The kilns developed for firing marl clays at high temperatures were the direct ancestors of the furnaces that would later be used for more advanced metallurgical and vitreous technologies. The ability to control fire and to understand its transformative effect on earth and materials was one of the most fundamental technological breakthroughs of the era. The ceramic vessel was the crucible in which this essential knowledge was forged, a humble training ground for the more spectacular pyrotechnological achievements of the dynastic age. When we look at a simple Predynastic pot, we must therefore see beyond its function as a container. We must see the entire intellectual and technological universe that it embodies. We must see the deep geological knowledge of the prospector who chose the clay, the chemical knowledge of the artisan who prepared the paste, the masterful motor skills of the potter who built the form by hand, the artistic sensibility that guided the decoration, and the profound pyrotechnological wisdom of the master of the fire, who transformed it into a permanent new state of being. We must see it as a social document, an indicator of status, and a medium of economic exchange. And we must see it as a symbolic text, a canvas for the hopes, fears, and beliefs of a people on the cusp of history. The ceramic revolution was not just about making better bowls, it was about creating a new and powerful tool for interacting with, understanding and shaping the world. It was a pivotal moment when the people of the Nile Valley learned to take the earth, mix it with water, and give it a new and enduring life through the power of fire. Having explored the enduring legacies of stone and fired clay, We now turn our attention from the mineral to the living. We move from the bones of the earth and its alchemical transformation in fire, to the technologies born from the organic world itself, the world of plants and animals. This is the story of the materials that formed the true texture of daily life, the fibers that clothed the body, the wood that framed the home, and the leather that contained their possessions. These technologies were, by their very nature, perishable. They rot, decay, and disappear, leaving only faint traces in the archaeological record, often preserved only by the miraculous aridity of the desert sand. Yet, their importance cannot be overstated. This organic engine was what drove the daily rhythms of society. It was the mastery of these pliable, renewable resources that allowed for the development of agriculture, the creation of complex tools, the construction of boats for trade, and the expression of social identity through clothing and craft. To understand the Predynastic world, we must look past the surviving stones and sherds and reconstruct this ghost world of organic technology, for it was here, in the weaving of a thread and the joining of a plank, that the fabric of civilization was truly knit together. At the very heart of this organic revolution lies one of the most important plants ever domesticated by humankind, flax, or Linum ozatatissimum. In the fertile, well-watered fields of the Nile floodplain, flax found its ideal home. The cultivation of this slender plant with its delicate blue flower was one of the cornerstones of the Predynastic agricultural economy. Unlike wheat and barley, it was not grown primarily for food, although its oil-rich seeds were a valuable secondary product. Its true purpose lay in the long, strong, lustrous fibers hidden within its stalk, the raw material for linen. The process of cultivating flax was a testament to the growing sophistication of Neolithic farming practices. Farmers had to carefully prepare the soil after the annual inundation, ploughing the rich silt with simple wooden adze. They understood the importance of sowing at the correct time of year, typically in the autumn, to take advantage of the cooler growing season. They managed irrigation, ensuring the plants received sufficient water to produce long, healthy stalks. The entire agricultural calendar, which governed the lives of the majority of the population, was a complex technology in itself, a system of knowledge based on generations of careful observation of the river, the stars, and the life cycles of their precious crops. The fields of swaying flax were not just a pretty sight. They were the first stage in a complex industrial process, a living factory for producing one of Egypt's most vital commodities. The harvest of the flax crop was a specialized and labor-intensive affair that reveals a deep understanding of the plant's properties. Unlike cereal crops which were cut with sickles, flax could not be cut. To do so would be to sacrifice several inches of the most valuable part of the stalk at the base. Instead, the entire plant was pulled from the ground by its roots. Tomb paintings from later periods, which likely depict traditions stretching back into the Predynastic, show teams of laborers, both men and women, working their way methodically across the fields, grasping handfuls of stalks and pulling them forcefully from the earth. They would then knock the soil from the roots and lay the stalks in neat bundles. The timing of this harvest was a critical decision that determined the quality of the final product, a choice between softness and strength. If the flax was harvested early, while the stalks were still yellow, the resulting fibers would be incredibly fine and soft, ideal for producing the sheer, luxurious linen prized by the elite. If the plants were left to mature fully until their seed capsules turned brown, the fibers would be tougher, stronger, and coarser, perfect for making durable everyday clothing, sailcloth, or strong rope. This decision was a calculated one, a conscious manipulation of the plant's life cycle to produce different grades of raw material for a society with increasingly differentiated needs. Once harvested, the flax stalks underwent a series of transformative processes to liberate the precious fibers from the woody core. The first step was rippling, where the stalks were drawn through a large, heavy wooden comb to strip off the seed capsules. These seeds were collected and pressed for their valuable linseed oil, ensuring that no part of the harvest was wasted. Then came the most mysterious and alchemical stage of the process, retting. Retting is essentially controlled rotting. The linen fibers are glued to the central woody part of the stalk by a substance called pectin. To dissolve this pectin without harming the fibers, The stalks had to be subjected to the action of microorganisms. The most common method was water retting. Bundles of flax were weighted down with stones and submerged in a stagnant pond or a slow-moving channel of the Nile for 1 to 2 weeks. Bacteria in the water would feast on the pectin, breaking down the cellular structure of the stalk. The process was accompanied by a powerful and pungent stench of decay, the unavoidable aroma of linen production. An alternative method was dew retting, where the stalks were spread out in a field to be broken down by the alternating action of the sun and the morning dew. Both methods required careful judgment. If the flax was left for too long, the bacteria would begin to consume the linen fibers themselves, ruining the crop. If it was removed too soon, the fibers would be impossible to separate. It was a delicate balance, a mastery of biological processes that was central to the entire technology. After retting, the now sodden stalks were dried thoroughly, making the woody core brittle and ready for the next, more violent stage of processing. This was scutching and breaking. The dried stalks were first beaten with heavy wooden mallets on a hard surface, which shattered the woody inner core, or shives, into small fragments. Then, a worker would take a bundle of these broken stalks and repeatedly strike them with a long, blunt, blade-like wooden tool called a scutching knife. This scraped away the broken shives, gradually revealing the massive, raw, stringy linen fibers that lay hidden within. It was a dusty, noisy, and physically demanding job that required a great deal of skill to perform without breaking the long, valuable fibers. What remained was a tangled hank of raw fiber, a mixture of long, prime filaments and shorter, coarser tow fiber. This mass was then subjected to a final cleaning and sorting process known as heckling. The fibers were drawn through a series of combs or heckles, with increasingly fine and sharp teeth. This process combed out the last of the woody debris, aligned the fibers, and separated the long, lustrous, high-quality line fibers from the shorter, more tangled tow fiber. At the end of this long and arduous journey, what had been a field of green plants was now transformed into clouds of soft, silvery grey fiber, ready for the spinner's art. The transformation of this raw fiber into thread was, in Predynastic Egypt, a technology dominated by women, and it was an art they perfected to an astonishing degree. The primary tool was the drop spindle, a deceptively simple device that was, in skilled hands, capable of producing thread of incredible fineness and consistency. The spindle consisted of a slender wooden shaft with a weighted whirl at one end. The whirl, made of clay, stone, or wood, acted as a flywheel, providing the momentum to keep the spindle rotating. The spinner would begin by drawing out a few fibers from a prepared bundle of flax, known as a distaff, which could be held in the hand or tucked into a belt. She would twist these fibers together with her fingers to start the thread, attach it to the top of the spindle, and then give the spindle a sharp twist, letting it drop and spin in the air below her. As the spindle spun, it twisted the fibers into yarn. The spinner's genius lay in the coordinated action of her hand. With one hand, she would control the tension and rotation of the spinning spindle, while with the other, she would carefully draft or draw out a perfectly controlled number of fibers from the distaff, feeding them into the twisting thread. This required immense dexterity, patience, and a tactile sensitivity to the material that is difficult to imagine. The finest Egyptian spinners could produce thread so thin and strong that it almost defies belief, approaching the quality of modern machine-spun yarn. This skill was the invisible foundation of Egypt's entire textile industry. Once a sufficient quantity of thread had been spun and collected onto bobbins, it was ready for the loom, the machine that would weave the abstract lines of thread into a tangible, two-dimensional plane of cloth. The loom used throughout the Predynastic and Old Kingdom periods was a horizontal ground loom. It was a simple but highly effective apparatus. 2 parallel wooden beams were staked firmly into the ground, often inside a house or in a shaded courtyard. The longitudinal threads, the warp, were then stretched between these 2 beams, setting up or warping. The loom was a critical and laborious task. Hundreds, or even thousands of individual threads had to be carefully measured, arranged in the correct order, and brought to a uniform taut tension. The length of the final piece of cloth was determined by the length of these warp threads, while its width was determined by the width of the beams. Weaving was often a communal activity, with 2 women sitting on opposite sides of the loom, working together to create the fabric. They were not just producing cloth, they were creating one of the most important forms of social and economic capital in their society. The process of weaving on a horizontal ground loom was a rhythmic and intricate dance of hands and tools. The fundamental principle was the interlacing of the transverse threads, the weft, through the stretched warp. To achieve this, the weaver needed to create a space, or shed, for the weft thread to pass through. This was done using a simple but ingenious device called a heddle rod. This was a rod that was attached by loops to every second warp thread. By lifting this heddle rod, the weaver could raise half of the warp threads, creating the first shed. A shuttle, which was essentially a stick with the weft thread wound around it, was then passed through this opening from one side of the loom to the other. To ensure the cloth was tight and even, the weaver would then use a beater, a flat, sword-like piece of wood, to beat the new weft thread firmly into place against the previously woven cloth. Then the heddle rod was lowered, and a second flat shed stick was used to lift the alternate set of warp threads, creating a new shed. The shuttle was passed back in the opposite direction, and the process was repeated. This steady rhythm of lifting, passing, and beating, performed over and over for countless hours, slowly and meticulously transformed the abstract grid of threads into a strong, coherent, and beautiful piece of linen. Linen was the defining fabric of Predynastic and indeed all of ancient Egypt. In the hot, dry climate, its unique properties made it the perfect textile. Its cellular structure allows it to absorb a great deal of moisture, wicking perspiration away from the body, while its smooth, hard fibers allow air to circulate freely, creating a cooling effect. The vast majority of linen produced was a plain, tabby weave, a simple over and under pattern that was strong and durable. This was the fabric of daily life. It was used to make the simple kilts, or shendits, worn by men, and the straight sheath-like dresses worn by women. These were practical garments, designed for a life of labor. However, the skill of the weavers was such that they could produce linen of vastly different qualities. By using the finest, almost gossamer-thin thread, they could create a fabric that was incredibly soft, light, and translucent. This royal linen, as it was later known, was a fabric of immense luxury and prestige. To be able to wear a garment of pleated, almost transparent linen was the ultimate statement of elite status, a sign that one lived a life completely removed from physical labor. The social hierarchy of Predynastic society was thus woven directly into the very texture of the clothes they wore. The role of linen extended far beyond simple clothing. Its strength and durability made it an essential industrial material. Coarser linen fibers were used to create heavy-duty sailcloth for the boats that plied the Nile, a technology that was fundamental to trade, communication, and the movement of goods. The shorter tow fibers, a byproduct of the heckling process, were not wasted. They were spun into thick yarn and twisted into strong ropes and cords. This cordage was indispensable. It was used for everything from tethering livestock and rigging boats, to making the fishing nets that provided a vital source of protein for the population. The massive ropes that would later be needed to haul multi-ton stone blocks for the pyramids were a direct descendant of this ancient pre-dynastic rope-making technology. Linen was, in short, a foundational material of the Egyptian toolkit, a versatile fiber that could be transformed into a delicate veil or a rope capable of moving mountains. While flax was the undisputed king of Egyptian fibers, it was not the only plant material that the pre-dynastic people masterfully exploited. The reeds, rushes, and grasses that grew in abundance along the riverbanks and in the marshy delta were the raw materials for another crucial and ancient craft, basketry. This technology is likely even older than pottery, and it provided early Egyptians with a vast array of lightweight, durable, and versatile containers. Baskets were used for carrying and storing grain, fruits, and vegetables. They were used as sieves, as fish traps, and even as simple pieces of furniture. The skill of the pre-dynastic basket maker was extraordinary. Using only their hands and perhaps a simple bone awl, they could transform a bundle of reeds or palm fibers into a tightly woven, beautifully patterned, and highly functional object. The two primary techniques they employed were coiling and twining, methods that are still used by basket makers around the world today, a testament to their timeless efficiency. The coiling technique was used to create strong, rigid baskets, bowls, and containers. The basket maker would begin by taking a bundle of flexible grass or palm leaf fibers, which formed the core or foundation. They would then begin to coil this foundation bundle into a tight spiral, starting from the center of the basket's base. As they coiled the foundation, they would simultaneously wrap and stitch it together with a more flexible strand of fiber, using a bone awl to pierce holes in the previous coil. By carefully controlling the tightness of the stitches and the angle of the coil, the artisan could create a wide variety of shapes, from flat, disc-shaped trays to tall cylindrical storage bins. The patterns and textures of the baskets could be varied by using different colored fibers or by employing different complex stitching techniques. These coiled baskets were so tightly woven that they could be made almost waterproof by lining them with mud or bitumen, making them suitable for carrying liquids. The large coiled granary baskets were essential for the storage of surplus grain, a cornerstone of the developing agricultural economy. The second major basketry technique was twining. This was used to create more flexible items, such as mats, bags, nets, and sandals. In twining, a series of rigid vertical elements, the warp, were held in place, and two or more flexible horizontal elements, the weft, were then woven around them, twining or twisting around each other between each warp element. This created a strong, flexible fabric that could be adapted to many uses. Large floor mats made of twined reeds provided a clean and comfortable surface in predynastic homes. Sandals, a crucial piece of footwear for protecting the feet from the hot sand and rough ground, were expertly crafted from twined palm fibers. The intricate fishing nets, which had to be both strong and flexible, were a product of this same technology. Twining was a versatile and efficient method for producing the essential, everyday fabrics of life, the things that made a predynastic house a home. The skill involved in creating a perfectly shaped sandal or a durable, evenly woven mat from a bundle of raw grass is a quiet testament to the forgotten ingenuity of these ancient artisans. The world of organic technology was not limited to plant fibers. The mastery of wood was another critical skill set that had profound implications for predynastic society. The environment of Egypt was not rich in high-quality timber. The native trees, such as acacia, tamarisk, and sycamore fig, tended to grow in gnarled, irregular shapes and produced relatively small planks. This scarcity of good wood made it an incredibly precious resource. From the earliest periods, the Egyptians had to become masters of joinery, developing sophisticated techniques to connect small, irregular pieces of wood into larger, stronger, and more functional objects. One of the most important joints they developed was the mortise and tenon. A hole, or mortise, was cut into one piece of wood, and a projecting tongue, or tenon, was carved on another. The tenon was then fitted snugly into the mortise, creating a strong and stable right-angled joint. This technique, which is still a hallmark of fine woodworking today, allowed the predynastic carpenters to construct complex items like furniture and architectural elements from their limited local timber resources. The predynastic woodworkers' toolkit was simple but effective, a testament to their skill in making the most of what they had. To fell a tree or rough out a large piece of timber, they would have used the polished stone axes developed in the Neolithic period, with their tough, durable heads of basalt or diorite. For more precise shaping and smoothing, they used the adze, a tool similar to an axe but with the blade set at a right angle to the handle. A skilled worker using a flint-bladed adze could shave off thin layers of wood, creating a remarkably smooth and flat surface. For finer work such as cutting joints or carving details, they would have used a variety of sharp flint knives and chisels. Holes were drilled using a simple bow drill, a device that used the rapid back-and-forth motion of a bowstring to rotate a pointed flint drill bit. With this limited palette of stone and flint tools, the predynastic carpenter was able to create a surprisingly wide range of sophisticated wooden objects, from the handles for their tools and weapons, to the earliest examples of chairs, beds, and boxes found in elite tombs. One of the most profound and far-reaching applications of woodworking technology was in the development of shipbuilding. The Nile River was the central artery of Egypt, the superhighway for trade, communication, and political control. From the earliest times, the inhabitants of the valley had used simple skiffs made from bundles of papyrus reeds to navigate the river. These were effective for local transport and fishing, but they were not suitable for carrying heavy cargo or for long-distance travel. The great technological leap was the development of the planked wooden boat. The scarcity of long, straight timbers in Egypt forced the development of a unique construction method. Instead of building a frame and then attaching the planks to it, the Egyptians built their boats from the outside in. They would fit a series of short, thick planks together edge to edge, essentially building the shell of the boat first. These planks were held together not with nails, which were unknown, but by being stitched or lashed together with ropes passed through a series of V-shaped channels cut into the interior faces of the planks. The seams were then caulked with reeds and moss to make them watertight. This unique shell-first construction method, dictated by the limitations of their available timber, resulted in boats that were incredibly strong and durable. The discovery of several of these early boats in funerary contexts, most famously at Abydos, has provided archaeologists with a detailed understanding of their construction. These were not primitive rafts, they were sophisticated pieces of engineering, the product of generations of accumulated knowledge. The development of these wooden boats was a catalyst for social and economic change. It allowed for the bulk transport of goods like grain, pottery, and stone over long distances, fueling the growth of regional trade networks. It gave local chieftains the ability to project their power along the river, to move troops, and to collect tribute. The control of a fleet of these advanced vessels would have been a major factor in the political consolidation that characterized the late Predynastic period. The wooden boat was not just a vehicle, it was an engine of state formation. Beyond wooden plant fibers, the Predynastic organic toolkit also included the skillful use of animal products. Every part of a domesticated or hunted animal was utilized. The most important of these materials was leather. After an animal was butchered for its meat, its hide was carefully removed and preserved. This required a chemical process to prevent it from decaying. The hides were first scraped clean of any remaining flesh and fat, and then they were cured or tanned. While complex chemical tanning was a later development, the Predynastic people likely used simple methods like smoking the hide or curing it with salt and fat. This process made the hide soft, flexible, and durable. This leather was then used to make a huge variety of essential items. It was used for making bags and pouches for carrying water or personal belongings. It was used for making sandals, thongs for clothing, and bindings for tools and weapons. The tough, flexible nature of leather made it an indispensable material in a world without plastics or synthetic fabrics. Bone and ivory were also highly valued organic materials, prized for their hardness, smoothness, and beauty. Long bones from cattle were used to create a variety of sharp, pointed tools, such as awls for piercing leather and needles for sewing. These simple bone tools were essential for the production of clothing and other composite objects. Fish hooks and harpoon points, critical for securing the protein-rich resources of the Nile, were also often carved from bone. Ivory, harvested from the tusks of elephants and the massive canine teeth of hippopotamuses, was a far more precious and high-status material. Its smooth, creamy texture and its ability to be carved with fine detail made it the material of choice for luxury goods. The Predynastic artisans became master ivory carvers. They created beautiful, long-toothed combs, decorated with carved animal figures. They carved the handles for the magnificent ceremonial flint knives, like the Gabel el Arak knife, covering them with intricate scenes of ritual and power. They also carved small figurines, gaming pieces, and decorative inlays for wooden boxes. The presence of these finely crafted ivory objects in a tomb is a clear sign of wealth and access to the exotic trade networks through which this precious material was acquired. The integrated nature of these organic technologies is a crucial point to understand. They did not exist in isolation. They formed a complex, interconnected system. A single object, like a sickle, was a composite of multiple technologies: a carved wooden handle, sharpened flint blades, and a bitumen or resin adhesive. The construction of a boat required not just woodworking skills, but also the technology to produce the massive ropes of linen or palm fiber needed for its rigging and for lashing its planks together. A leather bag might be stitched with a bone needle using linen thread. This ability to combine materials with different properties into a single, functional tool is a hallmark of advanced technological thinking. It shows a society with a deep, holistic understanding of its material world, a society where the woodworker, the flint knapper, the spinner, and the rope maker all contributed their specialized skills to a shared technological project. This web of interconnected crafts was the true engine of the Predynastic economy. The social implications of this organic engine were profound. The production of high-quality textiles, furniture, and other crafted goods required a significant investment of time and specialized skill. This inevitably led to the emergence of craft specialization. While a single household might produce its own simple baskets and coarse cloth, the creation of a piece of fine, translucent linen or a beautifully carved ivory comb was likely the work of a dedicated, full-time artisan. These artisans, with their rare and valuable skills, would have held a special place in society. Their work would have been commissioned and controlled by the emerging elite, the powerful chieftains and early kings who were consolidating their power. The control over the production and distribution of these luxury organic goods became a key way of demonstrating and maintaining social status. A fine linen robe, an ebony and ivory box, or a large sea-going boat were not just functional items, they were powerful symbols of wealth, prestige, and political power. Furthermore, the development of these technologies had a massive impact on daily life, comfort, and health. The invention of woven mats and textiles provided a cleaner, more comfortable, and more insulated living environment. Beds made of wood and woven reeds lifted people off the cold, damp ground. Sandals protected their feet. Clothing provided not just modesty but protection from the sun and insects. The ability to create strong nets and harpoons dramatically increased the efficiency of fishing and hunting, providing a more stable and protein-rich food supply. The development of large baskets and other containers for the storage of food and water was a critical innovation that allowed communities to survive lean periods and to build up a surplus. These seemingly simple organic technologies were, in fact, fundamental to improving the quality of life, increasing life expectancy, and allowing for the population growth that was a prerequisite for the development of a complex, urbanized society. The organic world also provided the materials for the earliest forms of symbolic and artistic expression beyond the mineral world of palettes and pottery. The carved ivory handles, the animal-shaped figurines, and the woven patterns in baskets were all mediums for a shared visual language. But perhaps most importantly, the organic world provided the first medium for portable information storage: papyrus. While the great scrolls of the dynastic age were a later development, the use of the papyrus plant was ancient. Its tough outer rind was used for making ropes and sandals. Its pith was a food source, and it is highly likely that simple, single sheets of papyrus were being produced and used for record-keeping long before the first pharaohs. The ability to create a lightweight, portable surface for marking symbols upon was a cognitive technology of immense importance. A precursor to true writing, this technology, too, was a product of the organic engine, a gift from the marshes of the Nile. The great tragedy, of course, is that this entire technological universe has largely vanished. Wood rots, linen turns to dust, and leather disintegrates. Our understanding of this world is based on a frustratingly incomplete and biased archaeological record. We are reliant on the scraps and fragments that happen to survive in the hyper-arid conditions of the desert edge, primarily in funerary contexts. A nobleman's tomb might preserve a beautiful wooden bed or a fine linen tunic, but the everyday clothing of a farmer, the fishing nets, the baskets, the floor mats, the entire material world of the 99% has almost completely disappeared. This creates a distorted view, one that overemphasizes the durable goods of the elite and underrepresents the perishable, everyday world of the common people. To understand Predynastic Egypt, we must engage in an act of archaeological imagination, mentally repopulating the stark landscape of stone tools and pottery sherds with the rich, vibrant, and complex world of organic technology that once gave it texture, color, and life. The legacy of the organic engine is therefore one of profound, but often invisible influence. It was the mastery of fibers that allowed for the agricultural surplus, the creation of clothing that signaled social status, and the ropes that moved the great stones. It was the mastery of wood, in a wood-poor environment, that spurred the development of sophisticated joinery and allowed for the construction of the boats that unified the Nile Valley politically and economically. It was the mastery of animal products that provided essential tools and the first great luxury materials for the elite. These technologies were the essential software of predynastic society, the systems and processes that organized daily life and enabled the growth of social complexity. While the pharaohs would later express their power in the eternal language of stone, that power was built upon a foundation of perishable materials, Upon the quiet, accumulated knowledge of how to spin a thread, weave a basket, and join a plank of wood, the grand machine of the pharaonic state was powered by this silent organic engine. Our journey into the technological landscape of Predynastic Egypt has so far taken us through the enduring worlds of stone, clay, and organic fibers. We have seen how the inhabitants of the Nile Valley became masters of their geological and biological environments, learning to shape, transform, and combine these materials with astonishing skill. But now we arrive at a technology that represented a new and profound rupture in the human experience. A technology that was not about shaping what was already there, but about creating an entirely new category of substance. This is the story of metallurgy, the science and magic of extracting metal from rock. The discovery that certain greenish stones, when subjected to intense heat, could be made to bleed a strange, glittering, and infinitely malleable new material, was a discovery that would change the world forever. In the Predynastic period, this was a nascent technology, shrouded in ritual and controlled by the powerful. But its development, from the simple cold hammering of native copper to the complex alchemy of smelting and casting, was a pivotal chapter in the rise of the pharaoh. The fire of the desert, which had for so long been used to harden clay, was now being harnessed for a far more potent purpose, to unlock the hidden power gleaming within the stone. The very first encounters with metal in Predynastic Egypt were not with smelted ores, but with materials that were found in their pure, metallic state. These were native metals, rare gifts of geology that required no complex chemical transformation. The most significant of these was native copper. Small nodules and veins of pure copper could be found in the mountainous regions of the Eastern Desert and the Sinai Peninsula. Early Egyptians, prospecting for the colorful minerals used for cosmetic palettes, would have undoubtedly stumbled upon these strange, heavy, reddish-green rocks. Unlike other stones, these did not fracture or shatter when struck with a hammerstone. Instead, they bent, flattened, and deformed. This unique property of malleability was the key. It allowed these early artisans to take a small nugget of native copper, and through a process of patient hammering, or cold working, to shape it into small, useful objects like beads, pins, awls, and fishhooks. This was metallurgy in its most elemental form, a direct, physical manipulation of a metal, without the use of high heat. These earliest copper artifacts were extremely rare and valuable, likely seen as magical curiosities rather than practical tools. Their greenish oxidized color may have also linked them symbolically to fertility and regeneration, making them potent materials for amulets and personal adornments. Another source of native metal, even rarer and more highly prized, literally fell from the heavens. This was meteoritic iron. Occasionally, iron-nickel meteorites would survive their fiery descent through the atmosphere and impact the Egyptian desert. The discovery of one of these objects would have been a momentous event. The material was incredibly hard, far harder than copper, and its celestial origin would have imbued it with immense supernatural power. The Egyptians called it Bayan Pet, which translates as iron from the sky, a name that explicitly acknowledges its otherworldly source. Working this meteoritic iron was incredibly difficult. It could not be melted with predynastic technology, so it had to be painstakingly hammered into shape, a process requiring immense effort. The most famous example of this is a string of small, tubular beads found in a predynastic tomb at Gez. Scientific analysis has confirmed that they were made from a hammered sheet of meteoritic iron that was then rolled into a tube. To the individual buried in that tomb, these simple iron beads would have been more precious than any amount of gold or lapis lazuli. They were fragments of the divine cosmos itself, tangible pieces of the night sky made wearable. This early association of iron with the heavens would endure for millennia, long before the Iron Age proper began. The true metallurgical revolution, however, began with a conceptual leap of staggering importance: the discovery of smelting. This was the realization that the common, greenish copper ore minerals, like malachite and nazarite, were not just pretty stones for grinding into eye paint, but were in fact the source of metallic copper itself. It is a discovery that could only have been made through the mastery of pyrotechnology, likely within the context of the ceramic industry. One can plausibly imagine a scenario where a piece of malachite was accidentally included in a pottery firing. Perhaps it was used as a pigment, or a malachite bead fell into the kiln. In the intense heat of a high-temperature marl clay firing surrounded by the carbon-rich, reducing atmosphere of the burning fuel, a chemical miracle would have occurred. The heat and the carbon monoxide would have stripped the oxygen atoms away from the copper carbonate, reducing the ore back to its elemental state. The next morning, sifting through the ashes, the potter would have found not a green stone, but a small, gleaming molten globule of pure, red, metallic copper. It would have seemed like an act of elemental transformation, a form of magic. This was not just finding metal, it was making metal. This discovery, once understood and replicated, set Egypt on a new technological trajectory. The earliest smelting operations were small-scale and likely shrouded in ritual. The process required a furnace or crucible capable of reaching temperatures of over 185 degrees Celsius, the melting point of copper. This was a significant step up from the temperatures required for even the most advanced pottery firing. To achieve this, the predynastic metallurgists would have had to develop more sophisticated furnace technology. This likely involved building small, clay-lined pit furnaces, perhaps dug into the side of a natural embankment to take advantage of the prevailing winds. To raise the temperature of the charcoal fire, they needed to actively force air into the furnace. This was done using blowpipes, long ceramic or reed tubes through which a worker would blow, directing a continuous stream of oxygen into the heart of the fire. Later, this technology would evolve into the use of pot bellows, but the principle remained the same. It was a physically demanding and dangerous job. The metallurgist was not just a craftsman, he was a master of fire, a specialist, who possessed a secret and powerful knowledge, able to command the very elements to create a substance of immense value and power. The primary copper ore used in Predynastic Egypt was malachite, a copper carbonate that is abundant in the eastern desert and Sinai. The process of smelting was a multi-stage affair. The raw ore was first crushed into a fine powder using stone grinders. It was then mixed with a flux, a substance like iron oxide, which helped to lower the melting point and separate the molten copper from the rocky waste material, or slag. This mixture was then placed into a crucible or directly into the furnace with charcoal fuel. The intense bellow-driven heat would initiate the chemical reduction. As the molten copper trickled down to the bottom of the furnace, the lighter, glassy slag would float on top. After the smelt was complete, the furnace was allowed to cool. The hardened slag cake was then broken and removed, revealing the precious, raw copper ingot at the bottom. This raw copper was often impure and would need to be remelted and refined to produce a usable metal. The entire process was inefficient, labor-intensive, and required a huge amount of fuel. It might take over 100 pounds of charcoal to produce a single pound of copper. This immense cost meant that for the entire predynastic period, copper remained a rare and prestigious material, reserved for the elite. Once the raw copper had been smelted and refined, it had to be shaped into a final object. The predynastic metalsmiths developed two primary methods for this: casting and hammering. The simplest method of casting was open face casting. A mold of the desired object, such as an axe head or a dagger blade, was carved into a block of stone or pressed into a bed of clay. The molten copper was then poured into this open mold and allowed to cool. This was a quick and effective way to produce a rough shape, or blank. The resulting object would then need a great deal of subsequent work. It would be rough and porous, and the upper surface that had been exposed to the air would be uneven. It would have to be extensively hammered to compress the metal, harden it, and refine its shape. This process, known as annealing, involved cycles of hammering and heating. As copper is hammered, it becomes hard and brittle. To make it workable again, it must be gently heated and allowed to cool slowly, which restores its malleability. The predynastic smith had to have an intuitive, almost instinctive, understanding of this property, knowing just how much he could work the metal before it needed to be heated again. A more sophisticated casting technique that emerged in the late predynastic was closed, or bivalve casting. In this method, a mold was made in two halves, each with one side of the object carved into it. The two halves were then fitted together, with a small channel left for pouring in the molten metal. This allowed for the creation of more complex, three-dimensional objects in a single pour. An even more advanced technique was the lost wax method, or surapadu. This was used for creating highly detailed, hollow objects. The smith would first model the desired object in beeswax. This wax model was then coated in a thick layer of fine clay, leaving a channel for pouring. The whole thing was then fired. The heat would harden the clay into a ceramic mold, while the wax inside would melt and run out, leaving a hollow, perfect impression of the original model. Molten copper was then poured into this hollow mold. Once it had cooled, the ceramic mold was shattered, revealing a perfect, one-of-a-kind metal replica of the original wax sculpture. This technique was a pinnacle of predynastic craftsmanship, requiring a mastery of sculpture, ceramics, and metallurgy all at once. It allowed for a level of artistic detail and complexity that was impossible to achieve through any other method. The development of metallurgy had a profound and immediate impact on the predynastic toolkit, particularly in the realm of weaponry and high-status tools. While stone tools remained the basis of the everyday economy, copper offered significant advantages for certain applications. A copper axe head, for instance, could be made much thinner and sharper than a polished stone one. More importantly, when it became dull, it could be simply resharpened by grinding, and when it broke, it was not useless. The broken pieces could be collected, melted down, and recast into a new tool. This concept of recyclability was a fundamental paradigm shift. It introduced a new form of material wealth, a substance that could be endlessly reformed and repurposed. The first copper tools to appear in the archaeological record are axe heads, adzes, chisels, and dagger blades. These were not common items. They were overwhelmingly found in the tombs of the elite, clear markers of their owners' wealth and their ability to command access to this new miraculous technology. The gleam of a polished copper axe was not just the sign of a better woodcutting tool. It was a potent symbol of power and prestige. The new metal also revolutionized personal adornment and the expression of identity. While native copper had been used for beads and pins, the ability to cast molten metal opened up a world of new possibilities. Smiths could now create more complex and varied forms of jewelry. They cast solid copper bangles, rings, and amulets. They learned to draw smelted copper into wires, which could then be twisted into necklaces or used as decorative elements. One of the most important new uses for copper was in the creation of mirrors. A flat disc of copper, when polished to a high sheen, created a reflective surface. These early mirrors, with their warm golden red reflection, were not just tools for vanity. They were objects imbued with immense magical power. The reflective surface was seen as a gateway to another world, and the sun-like disc was a powerful solar symbol. A polished copper mirror was an object of immense luxury and ritual significance, a tool for seeing the self but also for connecting with the divine power of the sun. The introduction of metallurgy did not immediately supplant the ancient art of flint knapping. In fact, for a time, it seems to have inspired it to new heights. The late Predynastic period, which saw the first widespread use of copper tools, was also the golden age of ceremonial flint knapping. The era of the magnificent ripple-flaked knives. There is a fascinating technological dialogue happening here. The forms of the earliest copper daggers, with their thin, flat blades, were clearly inspired by the shape of their flint predecessors. Conversely, the flint knappers, faced with a new and prestigious material, seem to have pushed their own craft to its absolute technical and artistic limits to compete. The micro-serrated edges of the finest flint knives, for example, may have been an attempt to mimic the sharpness of a metal blade. For a time, the two technologies existed in a state of creative tension. A high-status individual might be buried with both a copper dagger and a ceremonial flint knife, one representing the new, imported, technological power, and the other representing the ultimate perfection of an ancient, indigenous craft. The control over the production and distribution of copper was a critical factor in the political consolidation of the late Predynastic period. The sources of copper ore were not in the Nile Valley itself, but in the remote and inhospitable regions of the Eastern Desert and the Sinai Peninsula. To acquire these ores, the emerging rulers of Upper Egyptian centers like Naqada and Hierakonpolis had to organize and finance long, arduous, and dangerous mining expeditions. These were not casual undertakings. They required immense logistical planning, assembling teams of miners and guards, providing them with food, water, and tools for weeks or months, and arranging for the transport of the heavy ore back to the valley. The ability to mount such an expedition was a direct measure of a ruler's power, and organizational capacity. The control over the desert trade routes and the mining sites became a major strategic objective. The chieftains who could secure a steady supply of copper ore held a significant advantage over their rivals. They could equip their elite warriors with superior weapons, and they could distribute valuable copper goods as gifts to secure the loyalty of their followers, creating a new, metal-based system of patronage. Metallurgy thus became a powerful engine of state formation. The archaeological evidence for this early metallurgical industry is tantalizing but often sparse. The smelting sites themselves were located in the desert, close to the mines and a source of fuel, and are difficult to find. However, archaeologists have uncovered crucibles with traces of molten copper, slag heaps, and the remains of simple furnaces. Within the settlements of the Nile Valley, evidence of metalworking is found in the form of small workshops, often with casting molds, hammers, and polishing stone. The distribution of the finished products is also revealing. In the earlier predynastic periods, copper objects are found almost exclusively in a few high-status tombs in Upper Egypt, near the centers of power that could control the desert trade route. As we move into the late predynastic, we see a wider, though still limited, distribution of copper goods, suggesting that the technology was becoming slightly more widespread, but still largely confined to the hands of the elite. The objects themselves tell a story of escalating power. The simple awls and pins of the early period give way to the substantial daggers, axes, and adzes of the Naqada II and III periods, tools that were as much instruments of power and coercion as they were practical implements. One of the most significant and mysterious metals used by the Predynastic Egyptians was gold. Like copper, gold was first encountered in its native state. It was found in the quartz veins of the eastern desert, and more importantly, washed down from the highlands of Nubia to the south, where it could be panned from the river gravels as fine dust and small nuggets. From the earliest periods, the brilliant, yellow, incorruptible nature of this metal gave it a powerful symbolic resonance. Unlike copper, which tarnishes and corrodes, gold remains eternally bright. This property made it the ultimate symbol of the sun, of divinity, and of everlasting life. It was not a practical material. It was too soft for making effective tools or weapons. Its value was purely symbolic, social, and aesthetic. The predynastic artisans, using their existing skills from working soft native copper, quickly mastered the art of gold working. They learned to hammer nuggets into thin foil and sheet, to shape it into beads, and to draw it into wire. The use of gold in the predynastic period was extremely limited, reserved for the very highest echelons of the emerging elite. Some of the earliest examples of Egyptian gold work come from the tombs of the powerful rulers of Naqada and Hierakonpolis. We find small, delicate objects, beads for necklaces, coverings for the handles of ceremonial knives, and thin foil used to cover other objects, giving them the appearance of solid gold. This practice of gilding was a key technological development, allowing the artisans to use the precious material economically, creating a maximum visual impact with a minimum amount of metal. The techniques were simple but effective. The smith would hammer a gold nugget into an extremely thin sheet, and then carefully wrap it around a core of wood or stone, burnishing it down to create a seamless golden skin. This early mastery of gilding and foil production was the technological foundation for the almost unbelievable golden treasures found thousands of years later in the tomb of Tutankhamun. The ideology of gold as the flesh of the gods, the substance of eternity, was born in these early tentative experiments by predynastic smiths. Another metal that played a key role was silver. Unlike gold and copper, native silver is extremely rare in Egypt. For most of the predynastic period, silver was far scarcer and more valuable than gold. Most of the silver found in predynastic contexts likely entered Egypt through long-distance trade, probably from sources in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. It was often found alloyed with gold in a naturally occurring mixture known as electrum. True silver metallurgy, the smelting of silver from ores like galena, was not practiced in Egypt until much later. Like gold, silver's value was primarily aesthetic and symbolic. Its cool, lunar brilliance provided a beautiful contrast to the warm, solar glow of gold. Predynastic artisans used it to create beads, rings, and small decorative elements, often in combination with other precious materials like gold, lapis lazuli, and ivory. The presence of silver in a predynastic tomb is a clear indicator of access to elite, long-distance trade networks, a sign of a chieftain with the power and connections to acquire the rarest and most exotic materials from the world beyond the Nile Valley. It is important to remember that the process of metallurgy, from prospecting and mining to smelting and casting, was not seen by the predynastic Egyptians as a simple industrial process. It was an act steeped in magic and ritual. The transformation of a dull green stone into a shining, powerful metal was a sacred, almost supernatural event. The metallurgists and smiths were likely a special class of ritual specialists, their knowledge a closely guarded secret passed down from master to apprentice. Their workshops would have been liminal spaces, places of power and danger, set apart from the main settlement. The processes themselves would have been accompanied by incantations and magical rites, designed to ensure the success of the transformation and to protect the workers from the dangerous forces they were unleashing. This ritual dimension is crucial. The value of a metal object was not just in its material or its craftsmanship, but in the magical and ritual power that was infused into it during its creation. A copper dagger was not just a weapon, it was a potent magical object, its creation a reenactment of a divine mystery. By the very end of the Predynastic period, a new and revolutionary metallurgical development began to appear: the use of arsenic as an alloying agent. Early smiths would have noticed that some copper ores produced a metal that was harder and easier to cast than others. This was likely due to the natural presence of other minerals, particularly arsenic, in the ore deposits. At some point, the smiths made the cognitive leap from accidental to deliberate alloying. They began to intentionally add arsenic-rich minerals to the copper during the smelting process. The resulting alloy, arsenical copper, often mistakenly called arsenical bronze, had significant advantages over pure copper. It was harder, which meant it could hold a sharper edge for longer. It was also easier to cast, as the molten alloy was more fluid and less prone to developing gas bubbles, resulting in a stronger, more solid final object. The addition of arsenic also changed the color of the metal, giving it a silvery sheen. This new, improved metal was the high-tech material of its day, and it quickly became the material of choice for the finest weapons and tools of the nascent pharaonic state. The dawn of metallurgy irrevocably altered the balance of power in Predynastic Egypt. It introduced a new form of wealth, one based not on the ownership of land or cattle, but on the control of a rare, high-tech, and easily transportable commodity. It created a new class of specialist artisans and a new source of power for the ruling elite. The chieftain who could control the mines, command the loyalty of the smiths, and distribute the finished metal goods, had a powerful new set of tools for building and maintaining his political authority. The gleaming copper axe became a symbol of his ability to clear forests and build larger structures. The copper dagger became a symbol of his military might. The golden adornments became a symbol of his connection to the god. The new technology was both a practical and an ideological weapon, and it played a crucial role in the final push towards state formation. The legacy of Predynastic metallurgy is immense. It was during these formative centuries that the fundamental principles of extracting, casting, and working metals were discovered and refined. This body of knowledge, hard-won through generations of dangerous, patient experimentation, was the essential prerequisite for the Bronze Age civilization of the Old Kingdom. The small charcoal-fired pit furnaces of the Predynastic miners were the direct ancestors of the great industrial smelting operations that would later produce tons of copper and bronze for the tools of the pyramid builders and the armies of the pharaohs. The skills of the Predynastic Sist, who learned to cast a simple copper axe, were passed down and elaborated upon to create the magnificent bronze statues of the new kingdom. The reverence for gold, born from the discovery of small, shining nuggets in the desert streams, blossomed into the vast and complex theological and artistic tradition that produced the treasures of Tutankhamun. The fire in the desert, first kindled by a forgotten potter or a curious prospector, had unlocked a power that would literally reshape the future of Egyptian civilization, providing it with a new, glittering and formidable edge. In our exploration of Predynastic Egypt's hidden technologies, we have delved into the tangible worlds of stone, clay, fiber, and metal. We have seen how the mastery of these materials allowed for the creation of sophisticated tools, beautiful art, and powerful symbols. But the most profound and impactful technologies of this era were not things that can be held in the hand or found in the soil by an archaeologist's trowel. They were the invisible technologies of the mind and of society. This is the story of the social and cognitive software that organized thousands of individuals into a single cohesive political entity for the first time in human history. It is the story of the development of ideology, the power of long-distance trade, the birth of writing, and the creation of the administrative and symbolic architecture of the state. These were the forces that took the raw materials of predynastic culture, the skilled craftspeople, the agricultural surplus, the emerging elite, and organized them into the magnificent, enduring structure that would become Pharaonic Egypt. This was the invisible blueprint, the set of rules, beliefs, and systems that made the construction of a nation possible. At the heart of this social transformation was the development of a new and potent ideology of power. Throughout the early predynastic period, society was likely organized into small, relatively egalitarian farming villages. Leadership was probably based on kinship and the authority of village elders. However, as the population grew and society became more complex, a new form of leadership began to emerge. Powerful individuals, or big men, likely the heads of influential lineages, rose to prominence. Their power was initially based on their personal abilities, their skill as hunters or warriors, their charisma, or their perceived ability to mediate with the divine forces that controlled the fertility of the land and the river. They commanded loyalty by hosting feasts, redistributing surplus grain, and leading successful raids against their neighbors. This was a fragile and personalized form of power, heavily reliant on the individual leader's success and generosity. To become permanent and hereditary, this power needed to be legitimized. It needed an ideology. It needed to be seen not as the achievement of one man, but as part of the sacred cosmic order. This new ideology found its most powerful expression in the realm of funerary ritual. The tomb, from the earliest predynastic periods, was more than just a place to dispose of the dead. It was a stage for social display and a statement about the deceased's place in the community. In the early Badarian and Nakadali periods, most graves were simple oval pits, containing the body in a flexed fetal position, accompanied by a few simple pots and personal items. While some graves were slightly richer than others, the differences were not extreme. However, as we move into the Nakadada-Tekken period, a dramatic change occurs. A small number of tombs begin to appear that are vastly larger, more elaborate, and filled with an astonishing quantity of wealth. These are the tombs of the emerging elite, the powerful chieftains who were consolidating their control. Their tombs became subterranean houses for eternity, often lined with wood or mud brick, with separate chambers for storing vast quantities of pottery, fine stone vessels, cosmetic palettes, and weapons. The construction of these elite tombs was, in itself, a powerful technological and social statement. The labor required to dig a massive tomb, to line it with hundreds of mud bricks, and to furnish it with hundreds of valuable objects was immense. It demonstrated that the deceased and his heir had the authority to command the labor and resources of the entire community. The tomb became a physical manifestation of the leader's power, but it was also an ideological statement. The lavish burial was not just for the benefit of the deceased, it was for the benefit of the community. It was believed that a powerful leader, properly equipped for the afterlife, could continue to exert a positive influence on behalf of his people from beyond the grave. He became a divine ancestor, a powerful intercessor with the gods. The funerary cult of the ruler was thus a technology for social cohesion, a way of binding the community together in a shared ritual project that reinforced the legitimacy and necessity of the new social hierarchy. The tomb was an engine for the creation of hereditary power. The grave goods placed within these tombs were not random assortments of personal belongings. They were a carefully curated collection of symbols, a visual representation of the ideology of power. The pear-shaped mace head signified the ruler's role as a warrior, and the ultimate source of justice and force. The finely crafted flint knives and copper daggers spoke of his command over high technology and his ability to protect his people. The cosmetic palettes, now large ceremonial objects, were carved with scenes depicting the ruler's victories in the hunt and in battle, showing him as the master of the natural world and the vanquisher of the forces of chaos. The vast quantities of pottery were not just for holding food, they represented his role as the guarantor of agricultural prosperity, the one whose relationship with the gods ensured the bounty of the land. Each object was a word in a sentence, and the entire tomb assemblage was a powerful statement that this individual was not just a leader, but a central pillar of the cosmic order. One of the most powerful ideological tools, wielded by the emerging elite, was the control over long-distance trade and the acquisition of exotic prestige goods. Predynastic Egypt was not an isolated world. From the earliest periods, it was part of a complex network of trade that connected it to lands far beyond the Nile Valley. The control of these trade routes became a major source of power and wealth for the Upper Egyptian chieftains, whose territories were strategically located to dominate this traffic. They organized expeditions south into Nubia, the source of gold, ebony, ivory, and exotic animal skins. They sent caravans east into the desert to acquire copper and west to the oases for other valuable resources, and they established trade links with the Near East, particularly with the cultures of the Levant and even distant Mesopotamia. This trade was not primarily for staple goods, but for rare and valuable materials that had no practical function but immense symbolic value. The possession of these exotic materials was an instant and unambiguous symbol of power. An object made of Nubian ivory or Mesopotamian lapis lazuli was a clear statement that its owner was a person of immense reach and influence, a person who could command access to the world beyond the horizon. Lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone prized for its celestial connotations, had to be transported thousands of miles from its only ancient source in the mountains of modern-day Afghanistan. Its journey to a tomb in Predynastic Naqada was a testament to a vast and complex chain of exchange, and the chieftain who owned it was demonstrating his position at the apex of this network. These prestige goods were a form of political currency. A ruler could reward his loyal followers with gifts of imported beads or amulets, binding them to him in a web of obligation. He could also display his collection of exotic materials during festivals and ceremonies, dazzling his subjects and intimidating his rivals with this tangible evidence of his worldly power. The control of trade was a technology for building political capital. The evidence for this long-distance trade is found in the meticulous analysis of the materials found in elite pre-dynastic tombs. Archaeologists can use techniques like neutron activation analysis to trace the chemical fingerprint of a piece of pottery and determine its geological origin, proving, for example, that pots made in the Levant were being imported into Egypt. The presence of Mesopotamian cultural motifs, like the Master of Animals figure on the Gebel ul-Arak knife handle and the use of Mesopotamian-style cylinder seals, are clear evidence of the transmission of ideas and artistic styles alongside goods. This was not a one-way street. Egypt was also exporting its own products, particularly gold and possibly fine linen textiles, into the wider Near Eastern world. This engagement with the outside world was not just an economic activity, it was a crucial part of how the pre-dynastic elite constructed their own identity and legitimized their power. They defined themselves not just as rulers of their local territory, but as cosmopolitan figures at the center of the known world. As society grew more complex and the economy became more centralized under these powerful rulers, a new and critical technological need arose: the ability to record information. A chieftain needed to know how much grain was in his storehouses, how many cattle were in his herds, and how much tribute was owed to him by his subjects. He needed a way to label the goods being sent out on trade expeditions, and to identify the ownership of valuable commodities. The human memory was no longer sufficient to manage this growing volume of administrative data. This need was the driving force behind the single most important invention in human history. The origins of the Egyptian hieroglyphic script can be traced directly back to this administrative and economic imperative in the late pre-dynastic period. It was not invented by poets to write epics. It was invented by bureaucrats to keep account. The earliest stages of writing were not a full-fledged script capable of recording spoken language. They were a simple system of symbolic notation. Archaeologists have discovered small bone and ivory tags in elite tombs, such as the royal cemetery at Abydos, dating to the cusp of the First Dynasty. These tags are incised with simple pictographic symbols: a bird, a fish, a bolt of cloth, often accompanied by numerical marks. These are likely labels attached to crates of goods that recorded the quantity and type of product. This is a system of proto-writing, a way of recording concrete information about things in the world. Alongside these labels, we see the emergence of another crucial technology: the cylinder seal and the stamp seal. These were small, carved objects that, when pressed into wet clay, left a distinctive mark of ownership or authority. A jar of oil sealed with the mark of a specific ruler was a guarantee of its origin and quality, and it showed that its contents were part of the official, state-controlled economy. These seals were a technology for authentication, a way of managing a complex system of production and distribution. The conceptual leap from this simple system of notation to a true writing system, one capable of representing the sounds of spoken language, was a gradual but revolutionary process. The key was the development of the rebus principle. This is the idea that a picture of a thing can be used to represent not the thing itself, but the sound of the word for that thing. For example, in English, a picture of a bee could be used to represent the sound bee, and a picture of a leaf could represent the sound leaf in the word belief. The Predynastic Egyptians began to use their simple pictographs in this way. The pictograph for a mouth, pronounced could now be used to write the sound r in any other word. The symbol for a house, could be used to write the sound sequence pr. This was the breakthrough. By combining these phonetic symbols with pictograms that represented whole words, logograms, and symbols that helped to clarify the meaning of a word, determinatives, the Egyptians created a flexible and sophisticated writing system, capable of recording the nuances of their language. This system, which we call hieroglyphs, was in place by the beginning of the First Dynasty, its invention the direct result of the administrative needs of the unifying predynastic state. The development of this new software of writing had a profound and irreversible effect on the nature of power in the state. It allowed for a level of administrative control that was previously unimaginable. A ruler could now issue written orders to officials hundreds of miles away. He could conduct a detailed census of his population and resources, allowing for the systematic collection of taxes. He could record laws, create permanent archives, and write down the sacred rituals and myths that legitimized his rule. Writing created a new class of elite specialists, the scribes, who wielded immense power through their control over information. It created a permanent institutional memory for the state, one that existed outside the lifespan of any single individual. The invention of writing was the final critical technology that allowed the personal, charismatic power of the predynastic chieftain to be transformed into the impersonal, bureaucratic, and eternal power of the pharaonic state. The final element of the invisible blueprint was the development of a state art style. As we have seen on the late predynastic ceremonial palettes, a new and highly formal way of representing the world was emerging. This was not the lively, naturalistic art of the earlier decorated pottery. This was a deliberate, intellectual, and highly codified system for communicating the core tenets of the new royal ideology. The principles of this new art style, which would remain remarkably consistent for the next 3,000 years, were all established in this brief transitional period. One key principle was the use of registers, the division of a scene into horizontal bands, which created a sense of order and narrative clarity. Another was the use of a canon of proportions for the human figure, ensuring that the king and other important individuals were always depicted in an idealized, powerful, and consistent way. Perhaps most famously, they developed the principle of composite perspective, showing the human body from its most characteristic and legible angles, the head in profile, the eye and shoulders frontally, the torso in three-quarter view, and the legs and feet in profile. This was not a failure to understand true perspective. It was a deliberate choice to create an image that was timeless, complete, and easy to read, an intellectual blueprint of a person rather than a fleeting visual snapshot. The subject matter of this new state art was narrow and focused. Its primary goal was to glorify the king and to legitimize his role as the divine ruler who maintains cosmic order, or Ma'at. We see the king depicted on a massive scale, towering over his enemies. The motif of the king smiting his foes with a mace head becomes the archetypal symbol of royal power and the triumph of order over chaos. We see him performing sacred rituals, acting as the sole intermediary between humanity and the god. We see the world presented as a clear, hierarchical system, with the king at the top, followed by the gods, the elite, the common people, and the conquered foreigners and animals at the bottom. This art was not meant to be aesthetically pleasing in a modern sense. It was meant to be effective. It was a technology of communication, a form of visual propaganda designed to be instantly recognizable and to convey a complex set of ideological messages about the nature of the world and the king's central place within it. The development of this powerful and enduring artistic canon was one of the most important achievements of the late Predynastic period, a tool that would be used to build and maintain pharaonic power for millennia. As the third millennium BC dawned, all the pieces of the puzzle were in place. The long, slow Predynastic apprenticeship was over. The inhabitants of the Nile Valley, through thousands of years of patient innovation, had developed a formidable technological and social toolkit. They had achieved a complete mastery of stone, clay, and organic materials. They had unlocked the secrets of metallurgy. They had built extensive trade networks that brought the wealth of the world to their doorstep and, most importantly, they had created the invisible architecture of a unified state, a powerful ideology of divine kingship, the revolutionary technology of writing, and a formal state art style to communicate that ideology. The stage was set for the final act of unification and the beginning of the dynastic age. The scattered, competing chiefdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt were finally brought together under the rule of a single king, a ruler we know by the name of Narmer. The famous Narmer palette, with its depiction of the king wearing the crowns of both lands, is the great ceremonial document that celebrates this final, momentous achievement. With the unification, the full combined power of this entire technological and ideological system could be unleashed on a national scale, making the monumental achievements of the Old Kingdom not just possible, but perhaps even inevitable. The legacy of these invisible technologies is, in a very real sense, the entire subsequent history of pharaonic Egypt. Without the ideology of divine kingship, which compelled an entire population to devote their labor to the ruler's eternal life, the construction of the pyramids would have been inconceivable. Without the administrative technology of writing and the scribal class that wielded it, the logistical organization required to feed, house, and direct a workforce of tens of thousands would have been impossible. Without the established trade routes to the Sinai, the vast quantities of copper needed for the tools to cut and dress the stones would never have been acquired. Without the powerful and unifying state art style, the legitimacy and divine nature of the king could not have been effectively communicated across the entire length of the nation. The Old Kingdom did not invent these things. It inherited them from its predynastic predecessors and scaled them up to a degree that the world had never before seen. The Great Pyramids of Giza are the final, spectacular end product of a social and technological blueprint that was drawn up and perfected during the long-forgotten centuries of the predynastic age. To fully appreciate the significance of these social technologies, we must see them as a form of software running on the hardware of the physical technologies we explored earlier. The most beautifully crafted stone vessel or the sharpest copper axe is of limited social impact without a system of trade to move it, a social structure to give it value as a prestige good, and a funerary ideology that makes it a necessary component of an elite burial. Conversely, an ideology of kingship remains a mere idea without the tangible symbols of power, the mace heads, the imported jewelry, the grand tombs to make it real and visible to the populace. It was the dynamic interplay between the tangible and the intangible, the physical and the ideological, that created the extraordinary feedback loop of the late Predynastic. Advances in craft technology allowed for more impressive symbols of power, which in turn helped leaders to consolidate their authority, allowing them to command more labor and resources to further develop technology and acquire more prestige goods. This was the engine that drove the society towards ever-increasing complexity and ultimately towards unification. In conclusion, the story of Predynastic Egypt is not one of a simple linear progression towards the glories of the dynastic age. It is a story of multiple, overlapping technological revolutions, each one building upon the last. It began with the deep time of the Stone Age, with the mastery of the fundamental properties of the local lithic landscape. This was followed by the alchemical revolution of ceramics, a technology that transformed not only the daily life of cooking and storage, but also provided a new canvas for artistic and symbolic expression. Parallel to this was the quiet revolution of the organic engine, the mastery of fibers and woods that created the very texture of society. Upon this foundation came the fire of metallurgy, a new and powerful technology that created a new form of wealth and became a potent tool for the elite. But the final and most crucial revolution was the invisible one. It was the development of the social software, the ideologies, the trade networks, the administrative systems that could harness the full potential of all these physical technologies and organize a scattered collection of people into a single, powerful, and enduring state. The pharaohs did not build their civilization from scratch. They stood upon the shoulders of countless nameless innovators from the time before, the forgotten geniuses who had painstakingly laid the invisible blueprint for their world. Our long journey through the time before the pharaohs comes to an end here, where so many journeys to Egypt begin, before the silent, colossal forms of the Great Pyramids. For millennia, these monuments have stood as the ultimate symbols of pharaonic power, their very existence seemingly a testament to a lost, almost alien technology. But as we have discovered, the blueprint for these wonders was not lost, nor was it alien. It was forged piece by piece, over thousands of years of patient human-scale innovation in the villages and workshops of Predynastic Egypt. The story of this forgotten era is the story of the assembly of a mighty and complex engine, an engine that, once switched on, would have the power to reshape the very landscape of human history. We began with the deep time of stone, witnessing how the simple need for a sharp edge evolved into a masterful art form. The mind that could conceive of the ceremonial flint knife, with its flawless polish and impossible ripple flaking, was a mind that already understood precision, patience, and the relentless pursuit of perfection. This was the cognitive foundation upon which all later monumental stonework was built. We then saw how the soft, pliable mud of the riverbank was transformed by fire into the hard, durable world of ceramics. The Predynastic potters were not just making containers, they were engaging in a form of applied science. In the bonfire kiln, they mastered the control of temperature and atmosphere, a pyrotechnological skill that was the essential precursor to the age of metals. Their pots became the first great canvas for symbolic art, telling the stories of a culture on the verge of expressing itself in writing. We explored the perishable world of the organic engine, the technologies that formed the soft fabric of daily life. In the spinning of a linen thread and the weaving of a basket, we found a society creating comfort, expressing status, and developing the essential commodities of a new economy. In the joining of a plank and the lashing of a boat, we saw the birth of the technology that would shrink the Nile and turn a long river valley into a single, interconnected political highway. We witnessed the magic of metallurgy, the moment when humanity learned not just to shape the world, but to create entirely new substances from it. The gleam of the first copper axe and the otherworldly rarity of meteoritic iron introduced a new form of wealth and a new, potent symbol of power. This was the fire of the desert, a technology of transformation that gave the emerging elite a glittering, formidable edge. Finally, we uncovered the most powerful technologies of all, the invisible ones, the development of a compelling ideology of divine kingship, the establishment of vast trade networks, the invention of writing to manage a complex economy, and the creation of a state art style to communicate power. These were the social and cognitive innovations that harnessed all the physical technologies and directed them towards a single, unifying purpose. The pharaohs, therefore, were not the architects of Egyptian civilization, but its inheritors. They were the ones who took the accumulated knowledge of these thousands of years of predynastic innovation and applied it on a scale that the world had never imagined. The Great Pyramid is the ultimate composite object. Its construction required the stoneworking skills of the flint knapper, the administrative software of the scribe, the logistical power of the Nile boat builder, and the metallurgical knowledge to create tens of thousands of copper tools. It is the final spectacular expression of a technological journey that began with a single, well-aimed strike on a piece of flint. The true marvel of ancient Egypt is not that the pharaohs built the pyramids, but that their ancestors, the forgotten people of the Predynastic Age, had already invented all the tools they would need to do it.